Oh, just a minute. Got it. Okay, so we're live now, just so you know. And there's a little bit of lag. Okay. Hi, welcome to Science Colloquium. Let me make sure that I have us. I'm going to share screen before I start chatting. Okay, here we go. Why does that look like that right? There we go. Hi, welcome. If you're here for Science Colloquium, we are going to start at exactly 3:15 today. So there's a little bit of a wait time. We just always want to make sure we have all our technical items figured out ahead of time. But while we're waiting, I do want to tell you a couple of upcoming events. On today, just so you know, today will be the rise and recent fall of the Sierra Nevada glaciers. And we have Dr. Greg Stock, our park geologist up at Yosemite National Park. And next week, we have Denise Godbout Avant, Stanislaus County Master Gardener with Wise About Water. And she's going to talk about climate change, recurring drought, becoming the new normal in California, and talk about where our water comes from, how it's distributed, and the impact of climate change on our water supply. And also we'll include ways that we can conserve water and have smart usage in our gardens and home. I also want to mention that we also have an upcoming Modesto Area Partners in Science Talk with Dr. Evan Reed. He's an associate professor of materials and engineering at Stanford University on Friday, October 22nd at 7:30 p.m. And if you go to the MAPS MJC website, then you can go ahead and you can register for that talk. And that will be on how AI can help design better batteries. And we're going to just pause for about 1 minute. Coming up here, our talk will start at 3:15. All right, everybody, I'm going to go ahead and get started. I'm excited to introduce Dr. Greg Stark from Yosemite National Park. He's park geologist. He earned his BS degree in geology from Humboldt State University and PhD from the University of California at Santa Cruz, and completed his postdoctoral research at the University of Michigan before starting work in Yosemite in 2006. He has authored or co-authored more than 50 publications on the Sierra Nevada geology, ranging from highly technical articles on rockfalls and mountain uplift to the non-technical book Geology Underfoot in Yosemite National Park. Greg is a professional geologist in California and was recently elected a fellow of the Geological Society of America. He lives in Yosemite Valley with his wife and daughter. I'm glad to welcome you here today, Greg.
Great. Thanks a lot for having me. Really appreciate the opportunity.
All right. Well, I'm going to pass it over to you now.
Okay. I will share my screen. Look good?
Yes, it looks terrific.
Great. Okay. Well, welcome everyone. I'm going to talk to you today about the rise and recent fall of glaciers in the Sierra Nevada mountain range. As you probably know, glaciers are a really important part of the geologic story of places like Yosemite Valley, shown here, and just about every other place in the Sierra Nevada from about 4,000 feet up to the crest. Most of the Sierra Nevada was glaciated, meaning it was covered with glaciers multiple times over the past several million years. And those glaciers had a profound influence on the landscape, sculpting the bedrock, creating U-shaped valleys like those in Yosemite Valley, really steep cliffs, big spires and sharp peaks. When you know what you're looking for, you see the evidence of glaciers everywhere in Yosemite. And Yosemite still has glaciers today, and that will actually be the focus of my talk. A little bit about Yosemite's long-term glacial history, but more information about the remaining glaciers that are shrinking fast up at the highest elevations of the park. So this is a map that I published 2 years ago, showing the extent of ice in and around Yosemite during what scientists call the last glacial maximum. It was the last time globally that the climate was many degrees Celsius cooler, so a colder climate, and there were large continental glaciers and ice sheets and large glaciers in the mountains pretty much throughout the world. Locally in the Sierra Nevada, we call this event the Tioga glaciation. And Yosemite National Park at that time was probably about 2/3 covered in ice. There was a large glacier that was extending down the Tuolumne River Canyon, which is here, if you can see my cursor. That's actually the largest valley glacier in all the Sierra Nevada because it was fed by an ice field in the Tuolumne Meadows area that was up to 2,000 feet thick. So huge amounts of ice feeding down into the Tuolumne Canyon, and then smaller glaciers in the Merced watershed feeding into Yosemite Valley, which is here. Now, I should probably define glaciers for you. It's useful to have a working definition of that going forward with the rest of the talk. So you can define glaciers in different ways, but the main thing is that it's a permanent mass of ice that persists from year to year, and that is thick enough that it deforms under its own weight on a slope so that it's moving, right? That's another key part of the definition of a glacier, is that they exhibit movement. Sometimes you'll hear glaciers referred to as rivers of ice. They're not quite like rivers. They don't flow turbulently, and they obviously move much slower than rivers. But there are some similarities, particularly in how the ice kind of finds the low point of the landscape and will move through. And like rivers, glaciers do a lot of work on that landscape, plucking the bedrock, abrading the bedrock, eroding a lot of material from the upper part of the glacier, and then depositing that material in the lower part of the glacier. And the last glacial maximum, or the Tioga glaciation, is just one of many glacial periods that have occurred both globally and Yosemite in the last couple of million years. And this plot shows the last 800,000 years of Earth's climate as extracted from ice. This is an Antarctic record, a very long ice core where scientists can look at the annual accumulations of ice and sort of count those back as tree rings almost, and model the way all the way down to the bottom of the core. So they are well dated. And from those layers, scientists can extract information about temperature, which is the blue curve on the bottom. That comes from isotopes in the ice, and also information about the composition of the atmosphere. So the orange line there is the amount of carbon dioxide in parts per million. And that's derived by literally sucking the gas out of bubbles that are preserved in the ice core. It's really cool. So in this 800,000 year record, you can see kind of a repeating sawtooth pattern. And that pattern is exhibited both in the carbon dioxide and the temperature. So there are important links there. You can drive a change in temperature with CO2, and you can drive a change in CO2 with temperature changes, but they are very much interrelated. And they also kind of have pretty similar minimums and maximums. In other words, those values have been sort of ping-ponging back and forth between relatively fixed values through time. And each time the line is low, that's a global glaciation. And each time the line is high, that's going to be what we call an interglacial period, a warm period. And for the last 10,000 years, we've been in a relatively warm period called the Holocene. Prior to that was the last glacial maximum, which peaked about 20,000 years ago. And without getting into a lot of detail, I'll just say that this sawtooth pattern is the result of ways in which the Earth moves around the sun, how much solar energy the Earth is getting, and through a series of different cycles that are all superimposed on each other. But this pattern's been going on for several million years, and there have been therefore dozens of glaciations that have occurred in the Sierra Nevada through time. So again, the last big glaciation was 20,000 years ago. Things warmed up pretty quickly. And by 10,000 years ago, we think that the Sierra Nevada was pretty much entirely free of ice. And then what happened is maybe 3,000 years ago or so, this is a little unclear still, but in the past couple of thousand years, ice started to form again in the Sierra. And particularly in the last 700 years or so during what was called the Little Ice Age, those glaciers grew a bit more. And then since around 1850, the end of the Little Ice Age, also the start of the Industrial Revolution, those glaciers have started shrinking back. So I do want to make the point that the glaciers that I'll be talking about from here on are not the remnants of the Tioga glaciation or the last glacial maximum. They actually formed more recently during the Little Ice Age. And it was actually John Muir who, probably heard of him, he was the first to discover glaciers in the Sierra Nevada. He'd lived in Yosemite for a couple of years leading up to this. He'd observed the evidence of past glaciations in the solitary boulders and the scratches in the bedrock and just the shape of the landscape. And he was kind of obsessed with trying to find an actual glacier. So in 1871, he set out in the Clark Range in Yosemite and made this discovery, which you can read the description here, but he basically walked over a moraine, which is a ridge of debris, rocky debris left by glaciers, and observed this mass of ice with curving flow lines and other elements of a living glacier. And so he was very excited about that and shouted, "A living glacier." And this was the first documented discovery of a glacier in the Sierra Nevada, and that was an important discovery. By the way, I should note that that glacier that he observed in the Clark Range is now completely gone. It's melted away, and there's just a bedrock basin there called a cirque. There's no more ice left. A paper published in 2011 did an inventory of actually some period of time before that of ice features in the Sierra Nevada. They found about 1,700 ice features. So this includes glaciers, which again, that's permanent ice that moves. Also ice patches, which are smaller bits of ice that probably don't move. And then perennial snowfields, which is not ice, it's snow, but it lasts from year to year. Things that we would define as true glaciers, they estimated probably about 120 or so. And those glaciers occupy north or northeast facing cirques adjacent to the highest peaks in the range, right? Those are the coldest, shadiest places. And so those are the places where ice will still exist. The largest glacier in the Sierra is the Palisade Glacier, which is west of Bishop. The second largest glacier by area is the Lyell Glacier in Yosemite. And I'm specifically going to talk about two glaciers in Yosemite, the Lyell Glacier and the McClure Glacier. So these are from Tuolumne Meadows. It's about a 12-mile hike south and up to get to the glaciers. They are right underneath Mount Lyell, which is the highest peak in Yosemite at just over 13,100 feet. And this is a view of those glaciers in 1972. The Lyell Glacier at that time had split into two lobes, an east lobe and a west lobe. And then across a bedrock ridge is the McClure Glacier. So there's these three masses of ice that are side by side up underneath the highest peaks in the park. And these glaciers form the headwaters of the Tuolumne River, should be a familiar river to you all, and also a very important water source for the city of San Francisco. So that river starts with melting of these glaciers. So this is the view of the glaciers in 1972. And here is a view of those same glaciers. It's almost the exact same viewpoint in 2014. And you can see that the glaciers have gotten a lot smaller. The east lobe in particular is really now just a few tiny scraps of ice, and also much dirtier. And that's because there's a lot of rock debris and smaller rock fragments and dust embedded within the ice. And as the vertical surface of the ice shrinks, all of the rock debris that's concentrated and spread throughout the ice becomes concentrated on the surface. So the more they melt, the darker they get. And that's not good, because the darker they are, the more solar energy they absorb and the faster they melt. It's one of many tricky positive feedbacks in Earth's climate. So one of the really cool things about these glaciers is that I think by virtue of them being in one of the most iconic and famous national parks in the world, we have a really long record of study for these glaciers. They're probably, if not the longest studied glaciers in North America, certainly they're right up there. So there's a very rich history of scientific study of these glaciers. And it started again with John Muir. This was in 1872. So it was the year after he made his discovery of the first glacier in the Sierra. And I should just say at the time, Muir was kind of locking horns with Josiah Whitney, who was the head of the California Geological Survey at the time. Mount Whitney in the Southern Sierra is named for him. Whitney did not think that glaciers played a big role in sculpting the Sierra landscape. Muir disagreed, which is part of why he set out to find a glacier in 1871. And although there's not a good documentation of this, my guess is that Whitney came back and said, well, how do you know that that's really a glacier? Is it moving? Because the next year, Muir was clearly very motivated to measure the movement of one of these ice masses. So he went to the McClure Glacier on the 21st of August in 1872 with his friend Galen Clark. They put in stakes made of white bark pine, and then came back 46 days later and measured those stakes again, and they had moved down slope by 47 inches. So basically they were moving at about an inch a day. And therefore they documented that these were in fact glaciers. So that's really the first scientific study of Lyell and McClure. And then not quite 10 years later, there was a really nice effort by scientists from the US Geological Survey. Israel Russell and G.K. Gilbert went up to the glaciers and took photographs and made maps, and published those in 1885. And just to give you an example, here's their map of the Lyell and McClure glaciers, which is really a kind of an amazing map for the time. There's a lot of information there. There's a really good depiction of the amount of area that the glaciers were covering at the time. And I'm particularly interested in that label that says moraines now forming. Again, a moraine is a ridge of debris that's deposited at the edge of a moving glacier. And the fact that the glaciers were right up against their terminal moraines in 1883 means that they were pretty much at their maximum little ice age position in that year. And therefore, as we document the shrinking of these glaciers, we really have the full history of their little ice age response to a warmer climate. Russell and his team also took a lot of what I think are pretty impressive photographs from 1883. This is a photograph of the east lobe of the Lyell Glacier. And it's black and white clearly, but there's a lot of detail there. And as I'll show you in a bit, things have really changed compared to this view. So then there were a few more studies, and the next important period of glacier study was glacier surveys by the National Park Service, which were started in 1931, really with the sole intent of documenting the state of the glaciers from year to year, with a general understanding that glaciers are very important indicators of a changing climate, and that we are all dependent on our modern climate. So we ought to measure the glaciers, right? In 1931, they didn't have a good understanding of anthropogenic climate change, but they understood that the glaciers would be a good signal of climate change, whether natural or not. So there were annual surveys, multi-day trips where they went up and made pretty basic measurements. You can see a lot of tape measures here and old survey equipment, but they were sort of taking the pulse of the glaciers every year. From 1931 to 1942, there was a little bit of a break during World War II, and then they picked it up again in the 1950s, carried it on to the 1960s, and then it was a little bit sporadic from there until 1975. And then after that, the glacier surveys just stopped, and don't really know why. But I picked it up again when I started in Yosemite in 2006. I want to show you a couple of photographs of the reports that these National Park Service rangers created after their visits. And there's a lot of great information and texts, but I just love the photographs because you can see them exploring these crevasses, these big chasms and fissures in the ice. At the time when the glaciers were larger, there were a number of really interesting looking ice caves. So they were exploring these. And for me, what's so fun about this is that they're Park Service rangers, right? So they're in their full uniforms. They've got flat hats and they're wearing ties in the ice caves. They definitely set a really high bar for wearing your uniform in the field, which is not necessarily a bar that I've always maintained. But again, I started as park geologist in Yosemite, the first ever park geologist in 2006. And it was clear that it was time to get these annual glacier surveys going. So we've been going every year, sometimes multiple times a year, to the glaciers to basically do the same kind of study that folks have done since 1872. We have a whole bunch of new tools, right? We're using lasers and satellites, but fundamentally, what we're doing is the same taking of the pulse of these glaciers that's been going on for almost a century and a half now. And in case you're wondering, I did once bring a flat hat and a tie and my full ranger uniform and pose for a picture in an ice cave, just to keep that tradition going as well. But it's not the best field gear, I can tell you that. Okay, so what have we done in terms of picking up the study of these glaciers again? One thing we did in 2012, which was 140 years after John Muir made his measurement of movement of the McClure Glacier, is we decided to redo that same experiment, knowing that the glacier had retreated a lot. It was much, much smaller in 2012 than it was in 1872, but we're curious, is it still moving at all? Is it moving at something close to the rate that Muir measured? And just to remind you, he put in these stakes and over a 46-day period found about an inch a day per movement, right? So I was definitely curious about Muir's methods and kind of had a hard time tracking down very much information. I did find this one sentence though, where it's one of the best descriptions he's got. He said the positions of these stakes were determined by sighting across from bank to bank past a plumb line made of a stone and a black horsehair. So that's it. We do know that it was a black horsehair and not a white or a gray one. So at least we've got that. But in terms of his overall methods, it's kind of unclear. My guess is that he and Galen Clark fashioned themselves these 7-foot tall stakes made of white bark pine. Muir set up the plumb bob. So it's just like a vertical line with a stone weight on some kind of tripod that was lined up against a distant peak. And then he had Galen Clark place those stakes along that vertical line of the plumb bob. And they came back 46 days later and found that they'd moved out 46 inches from that line. So I have no idea what his precision was, but we do know that the result was about an inch a day of movement. So again, in 2012, we set out to reproduce that experiment on a much smaller glacier. We were using a totally different set of tools, but the fundamental measurement was the same. And kind of the amazing thing is that we got the same result. So here's the stakes that we set out. We put those, they'd been in for a few years, but we measured them on the 21st of August in 2012, and we came back on the 6th of October, and we found that the stakes in the middle, the ones that should be moving at the fastest rate, were moving about 2.5 centimeters a day, which is basically an inch a day. So we got the same results as Muir, which was shocking to me because the glacier is so much smaller. I don't think that that's necessarily a sign of health. I think really what it indicates is that as the glacier has been retreating back, it's also steepened up a lot. And that steeper surface slope allows the ice to deform faster. And also there's a lot more meltwater that's getting in at the bottom of the glacier and reducing friction, allowing it to slide more. But the end result is that after 140 years, and even with a lot of area loss, the McClure Glacier is moving at the historical rate that Muir measured. And that was pretty neat to see. And you can actually find evidence of that movement when you walk around on the McClure Glacier or even explore underneath it. On the left is a big crevasse. This is sort of a tension crack that forms in the glacier as the glacier is moving over a bump in the bedrock below. And you can also crawl into this ice cave that's at the toe of the glacier and see that the ceiling has these really cool striations. And those striations are formed as the ice is sliding over the bedrock, which is imprinting these grooves in it. And then that space, the cave itself, is created because the glacier is moving over a bedrock step and is viscous enough that it doesn't just immediately drip down into that space. And we actually found over the long term that the McClure Glacier was moving about 7 meters or something like 22, 23 feet each year. And this year it moved something similar to that. So it is still a living glacier. Okay, and then there's one more cool story about the McClure Glacier. And that is that in going through the old records, we found a Park Service report from 1936 where they talked about finding a piece of white bark pine at the McClure Glacier, which they thought was one of John Muir's stakes. So they took it back to the park museum and archived it. And nobody had really heard of it since. So I checked with our park archives. They said, let me get back to you. And a couple of days later, they did get back to us. And in fact, we did have that stake. It was broken in half. But I got to hold a piece of one of the original glacier survey stakes that John Muir and Galen Clark fashioned in 1872. And you can still see the axe marks on it, which I thought was really cool. So it was really cool to reproduce Muir's experiment. It was really cool to get the same result. And then it was really neat to hold that piece of history in my hand and just feel really connected to Muir and the research that he had done. The footnote to all of this is that we did the same measurement on the Lyell Glacier over the same time period, and we found no movement at all. Every time we would measure those stakes, it had not changed from the previous time, even over multiple years. So that was also kind of shocking to find that the Lyell Glacier, the second largest glacier in the Sierra by area, was no longer moving. So because movement is a key part of the definition of a glacier, strictly speaking, we probably shouldn't call it the Lyell Glacier. It would be the Lyell Stagnant Ice Patch, which has a lot more syllables and just doesn't roll off the tongue as easily, but probably a more accurate description of this glacier. And we think that it stopped moving maybe as much as 2 decades ago because the ice had thinned to the point where it just wasn't thick enough to deform under its own weight. Okay, so because we have this rich history of maps and photographs and Park Service surveys going back to 1883, we're able to do a pretty good job of documenting the change in the glacier area. So like the footprint of the glacier. And that's what we're showing here. The dark blue is the older glacier area, and then you can see it shrinking back to the lighter colors through time. And of course, this is the pattern that glaciers are exhibiting pretty much everywhere in the world. Relative to their size in 1883, this is the sort of pattern that you're seeing. And overall, the footprint area of the Lyell and McClure glaciers it's lost about 78% of its area since 1883. Turns out, though, that while mapping the area is great, more important is to know the three-dimensional loss of ice, so the volume loss of ice. And that is harder to measure, but it's important because it's really a better indicator of glacier loss. It's important for quantifying, for example, how much water has melted out of the glacier and contributed to the Tuolumne River. And it's also important to know how much volume is left, because if we want to make predictions for when the ice will disappear entirely, that's the key piece of information we need. So last year, we took on a challenge to reconstruct the historical ice surfaces for the Lyell and McClure Glacier. And we did this by mapping geomorphic features in the field, so things that you can see in the landscape like moraines or trim lines, which are breaks in slope in the landscape that mark the high point of the ice. We also used a lot of historical photos and surveys. We did our own modern surveys with GPS and lasers. We also used a lot of LiDAR data, which is laser scanning data, in this case from an airplane. We were tapping the Airborne Snow Observatory data, if you know about that. It's a way of mapping snowpack in a basin, but once all the snow's gone, it's a really great way to measure the amount of ice from year to year. And then finally, we used satellite imagery to kind of fill in the gaps when we didn't have good photographs. And then we did some information in the third dimension from these Park Service cross-section surveys, a couple of points on the Lyell Glacier where year after year, they would just survey across the ice surface. And you can see the ice surface coming down with time, shrinking with time, as the glacier thins and retreats back. So we folded in this information as well. And it's basically a digital desktop exercise. So we're doing all of this virtually. And we start with a good digital elevation model, or DEM, derived from laser scanning. And then we put the glacier perimeters on there. So this is the glacier perimeter from 1883. And in 3 dimensions, there's a lot of information in that line because each point on the line has a specific X, Y, and Z coordinate. And there's also a lot of bedrock that's poking up in the glacier in different places. And that allows us to come up with a pretty good estimate of what the old ice surface was. So we can then create a mesh that fits those points together and then convert that mesh to a surface. And this is a digital elevation model for what we think the glacier looked like in 1883, right? So we have modern DEMs. This is a DEM from 130 something years ago. So it's kind of a neat thing to do. And then once we've created that initial surface, we go back to the historical photographs and use them to fine tune our modeled ice surface. So on the top, you can see a photograph of the west lobe of the Lyell Glacier from 1903. At the bottom is our modeled ice surface. And I think it's a pretty good fit, right? I mean, the key elements of the glacier as it looked in 1903 are captured in our modeled ice surface. Same thing from a different perspective. The east lobe of the Lyell Glacier in 1883, again, a good fit with quite a few key things that we need to capture, like the little ice fall there between the west lobe on the upper right and then the east lobe on the lower left. There's a little ice fall coming over a ridge connecting those, and the modeled ice surface captures that pretty well. So once we have these modeled ice surfaces, we can reconstruct the change or the loss in volume through time. So I'll just quickly go through some slides showing the retreat of the Lyell Glacier. should point out in 2012, California experienced, that was the first year of a very dry and warm drought that lasted until 2016, really. And the glaciers retreated quite rapidly during that time period. I'll talk about that more in a little bit. Okay, so with the reconstructed ice surfaces, we can now put some numbers to the volume loss through time. And also, in this case, we're looking at the change in ice thickness. So this is the surface of the glacier from 1883 to 2020. So just differencing those two surfaces. And it's huge. There's huge differences. The red colors represent up to 75 meters of ice thinning. So, you know, that's 230 feet of vertical change of the ice surface through time. And that's, yeah, that's a significant amount of change. The glaciers look utterly different now than they did in John Muir's time. And we know that this is correct by just calibrating the last few years. Again, there have been annual LiDAR or laser scanning surveys of the glaciers. And this is showing the change between September 2014 to September 2015, right in the thick of that drought. And the glacier surfaces were lowered by up to 5 meters or something like 16 feet in a single year. So that's a lot of change, to the point where when I was going back year after year in the drought, I could barely recognize where I'd been standing the year before because things were changing so fast. Then there's one more piece of information that we're really interested in, and that's the amount of ice that remains in the glaciers. And in order to do that, we have to have a guess, at least, of where the bedrock is under the remaining ice. There aren't a lot of good measurements or good methods to measure that for glaciers that are this small. Sometimes you can use ice penetrating radar, for example, but small glaciers are just too noisy for that. So what we did was to estimate where the bedrock was under the glaciers by using information from the adjacent bedrock, creating these cross sections, and then stitching together a surface that matched the cross sections in 3 dimensions. So that bottom left panel is showing our best guess at where the bedrock is underneath the McClure Glacier ice. And when we do that, we come up with a map on the left. It's a contour map showing the thickness of the remaining ice in meters, or another way to think of it is how far down is the bedrock below the ice. Again, those numbers are in meters. So for the Lyell Glacier West Lobe, we find that the ice is about 23 meters maximum thickness, right? So 60 something feet, which is not very thick. And that's probably why the glacier stopped moving in the last couple of decades, because it's just too thin to move. We did do a little bit of calibrating of our modeled thicknesses in the field using a cool and kind of bizarre instrument called a Hoike steam drill. And that person on the right there is carrying that steam drill as a backpack. Basically, it's a field contraption that will melt snow and ice, create steam, send that steam down a long hose with a metal nozzle tip, and then you just melt with steam a vertical hole into the glacier. And we did that around the margins of the glacier and found that our modeled thicknesses were pretty much right on. So we felt good about that. I also want to say that that person on the right there is a senior high school student. Her name's Ellery McQuilkin. She goes to Lee Vining High School, which is the closest high school to these glaciers. And I've been mentoring her on glacier studies for several years now. She's super motivated, and she actually took it upon herself to figure out who she could borrow one of these steam drills from to go out and make these measurements. So she's just an outstanding young scientist, and I'm really excited to see what kind of glaciology work she does in the future. We made these same measurements of the McClure Glacier. There we found that the maximum thickness was about 42 meters. So it's almost twice as thick as the Lyell Glacier is, and that's probably why it continues to move. It is thick enough to still deform under its own weight. Okay, so in the end, we can Now, I'll put some numbers to the historical ice volumes. Back in 1883, there was something like 47 million cubic meters of ice. Cubic meters about the size of a washing machine. It probably doesn't help you envision, what 47 million washing machines look like. But for these small glaciers, it was a lot of ice. And we did measure the density of the ice, so we can convert that to a water volume. Also, it's something like 42 million cubic meters of water that was stored in the ice back in 1883. And we've lost about 90% of that. So there's roughly 5 million cubic meters, 20, a little bit less than that in terms of remaining water volume. And on the left, we're showing the area loss, so the footprint change of the Lyell and McClure glaciers from 1883 to 2020. That's about a 78% decrease in the total area. And then on the right are our estimates of volume loss from those historical reconstructions. And that's about a 90% decrease in the total volume. So big changes in these glaciers since 1883. You can see they've always been in general decline, right? There was never a period where the glaciers were getting larger since 1883. But there are kind of downward steps. And one of the key downward steps that all three glaciers exhibited was from 2012 to 2015 during that very dry and warm drought period. And that's kind of a double whammy for glaciers, right? Because a big snow year will kind of insulate the ice. And for the summer, most of the melting energy will go into just melting the snow cover. And it's only really late in the melt season that bare ice is exposed. So maybe you only lose a little bit of ice in that year. But in a year where there's not much snow, that stuff burns off really early in the summer. And then all the rest of the summer melting energy goes into melting old ice, and you lose a lot of it. In addition, that period of 2012 to 2015 was very warm. There was melting occurring 24/7 during the summertime. So the glaciers took a big hit, as they did this year as well, because we had those same conditions, a small snowpack and a warm summer. So glaciers don't do well during droughts. And I'll just show you a couple photos. So this is the photo from 1883. And then the Lyell Glacier as it looked a few weeks ago in mid-September. Big changes. And the same view again from 1903 and in 2021. Okay, so I want to go back to this plot and talk a little bit about what it means these glaciers are disappearing. I mentioned before that there are natural cycles of glaciers advancing and retreating through time. That's very clear. So this is not the first time that these glaciers have melted away. And in fact, we know that there was probably no ice in the Sierra for thousands of years within the past 10,000 years, right? So these glaciers are relatively young. They formed mostly during the Little Ice Age, and they're melting away again. The difference this time around is that melting is not occurring as part of these natural cycles that are so well exhibited by the data from these ice sheets. They are primarily driven by the very right side of that orange line showing carbon dioxide, right? I mentioned before that the CO2 values were sort of bouncing back and forth between relatively fixed values, representing the exchange of carbon between the oceans and the atmosphere and the land masses on planet Earth. It's kind of the longer term carbon cycle. But beginning in 1850, what we figured out was that we can extract fossil carbon, fossil fuels, and burn that stuff up and put it in the atmosphere in a geological instant and really change the composition of our atmosphere in terms of CO2 and other greenhouse gases. And because we understand that more CO2 in the atmosphere causes temperatures to warm through the greenhouse effect, temperatures are starting to follow the increase in CO2. And that is what's primarily driving the retreat of the glaciers today, right? So it's different than why the glaciers were melting during previous periods of climate change. This time around, it's mostly driven by human-produced carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. So it makes it a little more poignant for me to go up to the glaciers and see how much they're changing now and know that we are all partially responsible for the glaciers melting away, right? It's like the cumulative effect of all of our actions. So there's one more thing I want to talk about in terms of glacier loss, and that has to do with the downstream implications. So this is a photograph of the uppermost Tuolumne River. This is the Lyell Fork of the Tuolumne looking up at the glaciers, and this photo was taken in mid-September. And in that year in particular, there was just no snow anywhere in the upper Tuolumne watershed, right? It had all melted weeks earlier. And yet there's still a lot of flow of nice, cold, clear water in the Lyell Fork of the Tuolumne, and that's because of glacier melt. Glaciers are buffers, especially during warm, dry periods. Like the warmer it is, the more the glacier melts, the more it sustains the river downstream. And we're looking at the fairly imminent loss of these glaciers. I'm kind of reluctant to put an exact number on it, but I think it's safe to say that within 10 to 20 years, we're going to see the disappearance of the east and west lobes of Lyell, and the McClure Glacier will be getting awfully small by that point. And the loss of the glaciers will mean a decrease in the late summer stream flows. It'll mean that the temperature of that water will increase, and that's going to have an effect on the downstream ecosystems, aquatic and riparian ecosystems. And just to show you that, these look like complicated plots, but basically what I'm showing there for 2 years, 2013 and 2014, is kind of the later part of the melt season. So after most of the snow has melted away and the streams are starting to drop down to what we call their base flows, kind of like their standard low flows this time of year. So these are during drought years, they're during the later season. And I'm showing you records from 2 stream gauges. One of them is right downstream of the glaciers, that's the dark blue line. And one of them is in Tuolumne Meadows, near the Tuolumne Meadows campground, if you know where that is. It's like 12 miles, 13 miles downstream of the other gauge, and that's the light blue line. And the key thing is both, you can see it in the lines where they converge, and also on the bar plots on the right side, is that they're pretty much the same, meaning that there are not other large contributors to the flow of water in Tuolumne Meadows besides the glaciers. Like something like 75% of the base flows of the Tuolumne River in Tuolumne Meadows in the late summer and fall is provided by glacier melt, right? So the glaciers are just really important in sustaining these streams through the driest parts of the year. I want to emphasize that the total volume of water being contributed by glacier melt is trivial compared to the massive amounts of snow that are melting even in a relatively dry winter. But it's this time of year when there's no snow left, the only thing keeping the Lyell Fork from going dry, or at least flowing subsurface, is glacier melt. And when the glaciers disappear entirely, that's going to have some big downstream effects. I wanted to end with this autumn, and I made a point to get her up to the glaciers a few years ago because I knew that they were changing fast, and that it was important for her to see them and try to remember them as they look now, knowing that they're probably going to disappear in her lifetime. And this is a painting that she made up there of that. And it's kind of the note that I want to end on, beyond the science, which I think is pretty clear about how and why these glaciers are retreating, is just to acknowledge that there are a lot of losses associated with that beyond just the ice is disappearing. There are aesthetic aspects of losing the remaining glaciers in Yosemite. For me, there's the sense that this long history of research that goes all the way back to John Muir might well end with me or whoever the next park geologist is who follows me. Yeah, there's a lot of changes coming, and those kind of have an effect beyond just the data. There's more to it. And for me, glaciers in Yosemite are like the poster child for climate change. But that's because I know this place really well. And I think one of the important things that we all need to do if we care about climate change and we want to try to convince others that it's something important is to have everybody think about the thing that is most important to them that is threatened by climate change, because that's the way that people are going to be most motivated to take some action. So to summarize, the Lyell and McClure glaciers have lost something like 80% of their surface areas and more like 90% of their volume since 1883. A lot of that occurred just during the drought years from 2012 to 2015. If those trends continue, we're probably looking at the disappearance of the Lyell glacier in 10 to 20 years. And that influence, or that loss, will have big influences downstream for aquatic and riparian ecosystems. And in addition to those impacts, there's just a lot of things like the legacy of scientific research that will disappear when the glaciers disappear. So with that, I will thank you and take any questions you might have.
Hi, Greg, it's Liz. Let's see here. What is mine? Okay, there we go. Wow. I knew that I'm just blown away. The data in your talk was amazing, and seeing the comparison from 1885 to now, I'm just kind of blown away. And I read a lot about climate change and study it. A couple of us have been working on a class on climate change right now. And so this is some really interesting, another aspect. I hadn't even thought about those water flows and the effect of glaciers. So kind of a little blown away, to be honest. So thank you. And I really liked the painting your daughter did at the end. That was really nice. We do have a few questions. So I'm going to just a shout out from Gary Hayes. He says hello in our chat. And he did have a question. Have similar studies been done with the Dana Glacier just outside the park?
Yeah, I think the answer is generally yes. We have good maps and photos of the Dana Glacier from 1883, same surveys that Israel Russell and G.K. Gilbert were doing. The Park Service was most focused on the Lyell and McClure glaciers, but every couple of years they would go to Dana and make some measurements. And I mentioned the high school student from Lee Vining High, Ellery McQuilkin. She has been kind of focusing on the Dana Glacier for the last couple of years because, you know, the Dana Glacier feeds into the Mona Basin. So that's her home watershed. And she's done some really great work, similar to what I've shown here. So yes, the Dana Glacier actually has gotten a fair bit of attention. But I will say that there are lots of glaciers throughout the Sierra Nevada that are not getting any attention at all. And I'm quite sure that there's probably at least one glacier that disappeared this summer. And, you know, we don't even know. Like, there's just a lot of glaciers that we've not been keeping track of.
Right. And then once it's gone, you're not going to get that data.
Yeah, it's a missed opportunity.
So we need more geologists in the Sierra Nevada. Measure glaciers. Yeah, that would be terrific. Well, where could somebody see data on that? Where could we find any of that data on the Dana Glacier?
On the Dana Glacier, there is a webpage called Glaciers of the American West, and that's sponsored by Portland State University, Andrew Fountain and Hassan Basajic at Portland State. And they have compiled most of the historical photographs for Sierra glaciers and a lot of the historical reports, like the ones that I was showing pictures of the Park Service rangers.
Right.
So you should be able to find that online. And that's probably the best immediate source to go to for information.
That's terrific. I'll try to put that in the notes for the program.
Yeah.
And then so somebody put in the chat, can you go back to the 2020 ice and water volume? But there's no question. So I'm not sure, maybe you could recap on that for just a moment. If you don't.
Let's see, I'm not totally sure what the question was.
I think maybe I think they were talking maybe about that chart. Oh, maybe this.
My main point here was that we can quantify or put numbers to the total amount of ice that we've lost since 1883, and also the amount that remains. And it's like 10% of the ice remains compared to what was there in 1883. And what especially concerns me is that during the last drought, 2012 to 2015, we lost about 10% of the total amount of ice from 1883 in a 4-year period, right? So we had a drought year this year, the glaciers took a hit. And if we have another 3 or 4 years of drought coming up, that might be it, right? We potentially could lose all of this ice in a really short amount of time. I'm not necessarily predicting that, because conversely, if we have a huge winter this year, it'll push everything off for several years, which is why I don't like to say exactly when I think they're going to disappear. But the fact that the glaciers are so small now means they're really sensitive to an individual year's worth of snow, which is not the way it's supposed to work. I mean, glaciers are supposed to be good indicators of climate change because they record the longer term trends. But the combination of really small glaciers and then California's whiplash climate, where we go from record wet to record dry in a couple of years, it just makes it really hard to predict, exactly when they're going to disappear. But the trends are clear. We've got 10% left, and we're losing a few percent every year.
Yeah. And as they get smaller, they're less stable, and you can have a couple of seasons with a bad winter. And when I say bad winter, not cold.
Yeah, right.
And then you'd really have that reduced amount of volume during that time.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's why I'm pretty confident that these glaciers are going to disappear in the lifetimes of just about everybody who's listening to this talk. I think that's fair to say.
Well, it's a sad note to end on today. I'm just kind of blown away. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Those are all the questions. So I guess though I had one question left, kind of looking at this, but you answered it. It's really hard to project the longevity of these glaciers going forward. In any year, those variables are going to change. And so, if we go through a really prolonged drought right now, it could,
that wouldn't be good.
Sooner than later, right?
Yeah, sooner than later. I mean, again, I think you can look at these plots and see where it's headed, right? I mean, we're not able to predict within a year or 2 or even 5, but the general trends are quite clear. And we can do regressions on these lines. We have done them, and that the end result is something like 5 to 20 years is the estimate for total glacier loss.
Well, we need to do something quickly, but I don't know that our efforts to mitigate climate change or slow down our usage of CO2. Hopefully, if people aren't aware, there is a conference happening in Glasgow, Scotland in November, where they're looking at carbon and climate policies between world leaders. And I hope they have access to your data on top of the vast amounts of data that there are that show that we're causing these problems. I want to thank you for joining us today, Greg. It was a really terrific talk. I hope we had quite a few students watching during our live stream, and I hope more will join us in the future. So we'll leave this recording up, and thank you so much.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
All right. I'll talk to you later. Take care.
Okay, you too.
Bye-bye.
Bye.